This is BBC News broadcasting to viewers in the UK and around the world. I'm Martine Croxall. The headlines. One of the greatest footballers of all time, Pelé, has died in Brazil at the age of 82. He won 3 World Cups for Brazil, a unique feat, and scored over 1,000 goals during his career. Crowds have gathered to pay tribute outside the hospital in Sao Paulo where Pelé died, surrounded by his family. We'll look at the legacy of the man who gave the world the beautiful game and did more than anyone to shape modern football. Also ahead. Ukrainian officials say a fresh barrage of Russian missile strikes has inflicted significant damage to the national power grid. The British fashion designer Dame Vivienne Westwood, a key figure in the rebellious punk movement of the 1970s, has died in London. We begin with news of the death of Pelé, widely regarded as the greatest male footballer ever to play what he described as the beautiful game. He died in hospital in Sao Paulo, surrounded by his family, at the age of 82. He'd been suffering from cancer. During his career, he became the first and so far only player to win 3 World Cups and scored over 1,000 goals. He spent almost all of his club career playing in his native Brazil, after the government declared him a national treasure and blocked moves overseas, but was also a key part in the short-lived North American Soccer League, playing for the New York Cosmos. During his life, he was also a charity fundraiser, a campaigner and a politician. Joe Wilson reports on the life of a true sporting great.
The greatest, it's opinion, but Pelé led. Others stand on his shoulders. Well over 1,000 goals, a career of over 20 years, 3 times a World Cup winner. Brazilian football, synonymous with flair and success, was built on Pelé. In 1958, Pelé took part in his first World Cup tournament, aged just 17. He scored 6 goals in 4 matches, playing himself to the point of exhaustion. When Brazil beat Sweden in the final, one opponent said when he watched Pelé, he felt like applauding. Injury limited his role in the 1962 World Cup. In 1966, well, opposing teams knew they had to stop Pelé, one way or another. 4 years later, in 1970 in Mexico, Pelé was part of a Brazilian team widely regarded as the best set of players ever. They won the World Cup with the freedom of expression and fluency never seen before. It was Pelé's last World Cup. Without him, Brazil waited another 24 years before winning the trophy again. Pelé remained in demand. After all, he was one of the most famous names and faces in the world. He spent 18 years with one club, Santos, averaging nearly a goal a game. By 1975, he was in the United States, the ultimate acquisition for a new league hungry for glamour. The league didn't last, but Pelé still thrilled New York. After football, he took on ambassadorial roles, commercial opportunities, and naturally collected recognition. And Pelé expressed no regrets.
If I have to do everything again, since I was born until now, I will do everything again, and I thank God.
The popularity of football, the very idea of what makes it entertaining, began more than any other man with Pelé.
Joe Wilson reporting on the legendary Brazilian footballer Pelé, who's died at the age of 82. Well, the government of Brazil has declared 3 days of national mourning. And as we've been telling you, crowds have been gathering outside the hospital in Sao Paulo. This is the scene now. This is where Pelé spent his last hours, and over the last few days, one of his daughters has been putting pictures of him with his family gathered around his bed in hospital in the last few days. Here's Katie Watson, our South America correspondent.
This is a moment that so many people knew was going to happen, but at the same time dreaded, of course, happening. And now you can see the world's media, as well as fans who've come to pay their respects, have gathered outside the hospital where he died. Even the hospital put out a statement saying that they shared in the pain and the suffering that came with the loss of their beloved king of football. I think it just shows how important he was for so many millions of people, whether you watched him play as a young footballer or you were a younger Brazilian who was told about his phenomenal skills, he united this country, and I think that's so important in a country that has been torn apart by partisan politics these last few years. He didn't get involved in politics. At times he was criticised for not getting involved, but at the same time that meant that he remained a universal icon for so many millions here. The president-elect Lula da Silva, who takes over from Sunday, he said there was no number 10 shirt like him. He really was the king here in Brazil, and of course this country is now in mourning.
Katie Watson reporting. Well, world leaders have also paid tribute. Former US President Barack Obama tweeted, "Pelé was one of the greatest to ever play the beautiful game, and as one of the most recognisable athletes in the world, he understood the power of sports to bring people together. Our thoughts are with him and everyone who loved and admired him." President-elect of Brazil, Lula da Silva, posted, "I had the privilege that younger Brazilians didn't have. I saw Pelé play live. Play? No. I saw Pelé give a show. Because when he got the ball, he always did something special, which often ended up in a goal. Few Brazilians took the name of our country as far as he did." Former footballer, England footballer and now sports broadcaster Gary Lineker has been sharing his thoughts on Pelé's legacy.
Well, Pelé is, of course, regarded as a legend, but he actually is a legend, certainly in football terms. He won 3 World Cups and was a major figure in doing those, one of the greatest players of all time. Won his first World Cup in 1958 when he was just 17 years old and scored a hat-trick in the semi-final and then 2 in the final, including one where he flicks it over his head, over a defender and volleys it into the back of the net. So he followed that up with success in 62 and then again in 70, the only player to win 3 World Cups. So I think it's very easy to explain why he's a legend. He's unquestionably one of the greatest football players that's ever lived. And you have to be a certain age, of course, and I'm one of those people that were lucky enough to see him. My first World Cup, I remember, was 1970, that brilliant Brazilian side that he was the star of. And he had a profound effect on my love of football. No, we don't really have the access to see the amount of footage that we do in the modern game. Even with Maradona, we saw quite a lot more than you would do with Pelé, because obviously not so many matches were filmed, so we didn't see quite so much. And I caught him at the end of his career, but he was still outstanding. But he could do everything. He was, you know, for me, there are the 3 greats that in my lifetime. There's Pelé, Maradona, and Messi. It's difficult to separate them because they play in totally different eras, but all 3 of them do things that other players, other mere mortals of footballers can't do. And I think that's what really lifts them above all the others. Well, Pelé's hugely significant in not only the development of football, but also in football itself and the enjoyment of football, which is the most important thing. It's an entertainment business, and he was one of the great entertainers through his pure skill, talent and ability. And he was also a proven goal scorer. In that sense, he was slightly different perhaps to someone like Maradona and even Messi, who were more creative possibly. But Pelé was an out-and-out goal scorer, and he's played a huge part in football. The name Pelé is just synonymous with football.
Gary Lineker. Let's get some more reaction then from Brazil. Tim Vickery is a South American football expert based in Rio de Janeiro, and he explained to us how Brazil had been bracing itself for this news.
There's an element of being prepared for this moment, but when it comes, it hits people very hard because there's almost no one in Brazil who's old enough to remember a world before there was Pelé. He's so synonymous with the country for winning in style, and for winning in style with a smile on his face. He's the greatest diplomat that Brazil has ever produced, the greatest PR machine, I think, that Brazil has ever produced. And to put this in a UK context, it's a little bit like maybe losing Winston Churchill, Lord Nelson, Paul McCartney, Lewis Hamilton and Bobby Charlton all in one. So even though it hasn't come as a surprise, it's still a shock.
Even in a country where the population, so much of the population is extremely young, Tim, how much of an inspiration did he remain on and off the field? I mean, in terms of inspiring people to play football, but also knowing who he was as that sort of national hero.
Yeah, he's. What do you think of when you think of Brazil? You may think of the Amazon rainforest. You may think of samba and carnival. You will certainly think of football, and that's because of Pelé. This is a 9-year. Remember, Pelé is born 52 years after Brazil abolishes slavery, and he becomes the undisputed global king of the game. Well, that's an extraordinary story. It's an unbelievable story, and it's one that should never be taken lightly. As a 9-year-old child, he watches his father crying as he listens to the radio as Brazil lose the final of the 1950 World Cup to Uruguay. And Pelé decides to avenge this. And he tells his father he's going to avenge this. And just 20 years later, Brazil have won the World Cup 3 times. Pelé has helped them win the World Cup 3 times. And especially after Mexico 70. Mexico 70 is the first World Cup which is broadcast live to much of the planet. That habit that we have of downing tools for a month every 4 years and watching the World Cup. Now, we've just been doing this with the action in Qatar. All of that starts really with Pelé. It's Pelé who transforms this event into the most gripping sports event that there is. Does more than anyone else to turn the World Cup into the spectacle that it is today. And I think there's something fitting, there's something appropriate about the fact that his last lucid days on Earth coincided with the World Cup in Qatar.
South American football expert Tim Vickery. Well, perhaps Pelé's crowning glory was his 3rd World Cup win in 1970, the first time the tournament was broadcast live around the world. Andrew Downey's an author who's written about that World Cup. I asked him what that 3rd victory meant for Pelé.
It was his 3rd World Cup winners' medal. He won as a 17-year-old in 1958 and then again in 1962. But that World Cup, which was the first to be broadcast live around the world and in colour, that really put him on the map. It really cemented his place as the greatest player of all time.
And you can claim to have met him.
I have met him a couple of times, and it's funny because for somebody who was so well known, who was such a legendary figure, he was the most humble guy. And I met him on 2 occasions real closely. And I remember the first time he actually said my name. I was interviewing him and he said my name. And I remember my heart kind of stopping for a second and I'm thinking, Pelé knows my name. And it was really a remarkable moment for me. And he would often do this. He would remember people's names. He would put his arm around people when they were taking photos with him, which is also a real amazing thing to have, the greatest footballer of all time, with this legendary guy actually touching you and showing this, intimacy with you. That was the kind of a guy that he was. He was very down to earth.
How do you think he remained so when he had the world at his feet?
I mean, that's a great question. I'm not 100% sure. I mean, he was always, he came from a very humble background. His mother and father were very, were quite poor. Pelé grew up quite poor. And they always, drummed into him, that he had to set an example to people. And there's lots of people he's criticised today for not taking more of a stance against racism, for not taking more of a position against Brazil's military dictatorship. But his defence was always, listen, I was brought up to not to fight people, but to set an example. And what I've tried to do is to set an example of how to be like a good person and how to reach the top, without standing on too many people, without doing the wrong thing. And that was always his defence.
The author, Andrew Downey. Much more on our website, including a look at how the footballing world is paying tribute to Pelé. Just log on to bbc.com/news or go via the BBC app. Stay with us on BBC News, still to come.